and finish the afternoon with a panel. I have some bad news for you. According to the timing I got from the organizer, there is no coffee break. So we'll have 4 presentations, but Fabienne will do 2 presentations in the same time. But I will introduce rapidly the speaker. I'm sure everybody know who is who, but Fabienne is your chief, your head of trade statistics, while Luis is a team leader. You see the difference in culture. You have chiefs, you have team leader. Both are work on services, so they are competing. Partners. Okay. Yeah. You see the team leader. And my friend G, is well known, both from the statistician and the economist. You're a senior economist? You're lead economist. So.
I promised a few years ago.
Okay. At USITC, and he has been working a lot on the methodological aspects, but he will present us more results on China. But I understand we'll have some discussion first more on the micro aspects on trade by enterprise characteristic or firm characteristic. And Fabienne, please, you have the floor. Your entitlement is of 2 sessions, so it will be about 40 minutes.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Hubert, for this very kind introduction. And let me start before addressing the topic of heterogeneity, tech, and supply and use tables by thanking, of course, or joining Hubert in his words of thanks to INEHI for welcoming us here. I think we have a great location and a very well organized meeting with lots of people also helping us to find our way around the building and to the lunch and back again, and with nice tours. So I think with that, thank you very much for being so kind to host this meeting that we have organized. With that, I would like to move to the topic of my presentation. And as you have seen in the agenda, I am supposed to start to talk with you about tech, or the trade by enterprise characteristics data that we collect at the OECD, but also together with Eurostat, who plays a major role in these types of projects. In the agenda, you will also see a second presentation from the OECD, which is accounting for heterogeneity. And this topic has been mentioned already several times during this meeting, how important it is to take better into account the differences across firms within an industry. And the reason why I'm joining these 2 presentations is actually because the trade by enterprise characteristics data give us an avenue or a roadmap to help us to actually tackle this challenge of accounting for heterogeneity. And I think it's good also to highlight this, that it is also the road that has been taken by some of the presenters that we have seen today, notably from Mexico and Costa Rica, who have shown that accounting for heterogeneity in supply and use tables is something that is possible. And I know that our colleague from the USITC, Si Wang, he will also present the results for China that tries to sort of has shown indeed that it is possible to make this breakdown in a very meaningful and very interesting way, and that it gives us many results. I think there's many advantages of combining these 2 strands of work, the trade by enterprise characteristics at the micro data level, as well as the accounting for heterogeneity within supply and use tables, which is more a macro or national accounts perspective of the world. And the reason why there's many synergies to be had here is because one of the things that was mentioned yesterday was to say, like, okay, well, we have this huge new research agenda in front of us with many new ideas, many new classifications, many new concepts that we still need to work on, many new strands of work to develop. And of course, we are all facing, as statisticians, the big question, how on earth are we going to get all the data to answer these policy questions if we are not allowed to send out more surveys, if we have to be concerned about response burden, and if we are faced with reduced resources rather than increased resources in many cases. So I think trying to use the information that we already have in trade by enterprise characteristics, but also in the FATS data for an affiliate trade statistics, are avenues that can really help us to promote this agenda. And in my presentation, I will try to show you a little bit how we think that is feasible, how we think that can be done, why it is important, and also what, unfortunately, still some challenges we are facing and ways to overcome those. So let me just recap and go back to the beginning, and linking also my presentation to the presentation that was given earlier or yesterday by my boss Nadim Ahmad from the OECD on what we do with TIVA, with our trade and value added project, and what our strands for further research are. And I think one of the key assumptions that is currently used in TIVA, and that we really work hard on to try to make this assumption more realistic or to be better in line with reality, is the assumption of homogeneous industries. We were talking also about boxes. We treat industries as boxes with a content that is exactly the same. We do not separate out different types of firms within an industry. So we assume that all firms within the same industry are organizing their production in the same way, are purchasing the same types of products, are purchasing these products in the same balance between domestic and imported, are producing products in exactly the same way, and are also equally engaged in exports. Clearly, and I think all of us around the table recognize, and also some of the presentations that were given earlier that already presented some empirical results, this is a very unrealistic assumption. This is just basically not the case. So what we need to do, if we talk about TIVA and global value chain analysis, we need to take it beyond the industry level. We need to take into account the heterogeneity among firms to better analyze what is really happening in countries, how countries are really embedded in global value chains, and how the benefits are distributed across countries, across industries, and across different types of firms. Not all firms are equally or similarly involved in global value chains. Some firms are foreign-owned, others are not. Some firms trade, export, imports, others do not. Others sell their products to large domestic firms who are in turn exporting those products. So there's a wide range of configurations in those value chains, and we need to try to take those differences into account. And this is not only a statistical exercise or just for the fun of it. We do this because we have seen that the dimensions that I've identified and that we've collectively identified as important are correlated with virtually all dimensions of GVC impact. We know from academic research, from our own studies, that there are really big differences between exporting and non-exporting firms, importing, non-importing firms, foreign-owned firms and domestically owned firms, with respect to value added, with respect to productivity, with respect to the use of technology, with respect to their size, their growth rates, their survival rates, and nearly all other indicators of firm performance, both economically and socially. So it's clear that this is an important topic and an important road that we really need to start embarking on, and that we have in some countries and cases have started on. What I want to do in this presentation is to see to what extent we can capitalize on our existing work in, for example, the area of trade by enterprise characteristics, services trade by enterprise characteristics, which is yet another step, but my colleague from Eurostat, Luis, will explain more about the background of this particular topic. Foreign affiliate trade statistics, so the foreign ownership dimensions, and what we call Tech Plus, which means linking not only the trade register and the business register, but adding value-added employment, turnover, purchases, and all those other economic variables. And what I try to do is to see how that can improve our estimates of, for example, the import content of exports, and also how we can use that information to develop new and richer indicators on global value chains and how firms and countries are embedded in that. I think it's also important to emphasize that these statistics, TEC, Stec, FATS, are important in their own right. So what we see in many countries and in many cases that we see increasingly this link between TEC and TIVA. TIVA, of course, receiving a lot of policy attention, which means that it can be used as leverage to also start to develop other things. I think it's important to emphasize that indeed these trade by enterprise characteristics give very interesting and important information in their own right. And I think in particular Gerardo's presentation earlier showed already exactly that this was the case. And I know from talking with you that also your policymakers are very happy with this type of information. So what will I do in this presentation? I will first reiterate a little bit or highlight the importance of heterogeneity using the TEC, the current available TEC data at the OECD to illustrate this point. I will explain you a little bit on how those trade by enterprise characteristics data are actually compiled. I know many of you are working on this area or are starting at the moment to develop work in this area, so I think it's good to recap briefly how it's done and what are the main challenges involved. And I will move on then to see how can we use that information to break down the supply and use tables. And what will come from this illustration is a list of what would be the ideal additional data needs for breaking down the supply table by enterprise characteristics. And what I will show you is this requires a combination of TEC as well as other business statistics, including structural business statistics and FATS. So I will illustrate this breakdown, and I will finalize by also explaining some of the challenges that we still need to overcome. What we will see is that there's a lot of possibilities, but also some limitations that we can only solve at the country level, so with your help, basically. And I will illustrate a little bit on how, from the OECD side of things, we think that, or we are actually working on taking concrete steps to implement and to support these developments. So just to recap, and I think many of you will have recognized these types of graphs or have seen them for your own country. And one of the key things that is important when you talk about firm heterogeneity is to see that indeed trade is concentrated among only a few enterprises. We saw in the Mexican case that the top 100 firms accounted for 50% of trade, if I recall correctly. And if you compare this with the overview of the other TEC data that we have within the OECD, you see that that's pretty similar across all countries. In some countries, the top 100 of firms even account for an even larger share of exports. We also know, and this is particularly important if we talk about the import content of exports, for example, is that exporting firms are also the ones that are responsible for virtually all imports. So if you look at these percentages, and I'm not sure if you can actually read the left-hand scale, but these range from 75% to over 90% across the different countries that you see. If you talk about, okay, what is the share of imports that's actually done by firms that are also engaged in exports? So again, mirroring the Mexican results, there's few firms that only export and there's few firms that only import. What we see also is that the value of imports on average are larger for exporting firms than for non-exporting firms. So this is basically a different way of illustrating the same point, that the import intensity of exporters is really much larger than exporters. So we really need to account for this in our supply and use tables. It is, however, not only the distinction between exporting, non-exporting, importing, non-importing firms. Size matters. Firm size really matters. We see trade is concentrated among the largest firms. And also ownership matters. So foreign ownership. We know very few firms in our countries tend to be foreign owned or foreign controlled. 1%, 2%. We see, I would say, outliers of 3% of firms being foreign owned. However, these firms do account for a very large share of economic activity. They account on roughly 1/3 of turnover, 1/5 of employment, and around 1/4 of value added in most of the OECD countries. And also, in particular, again, linking this to trade, we see, and this is information from the recent tech information, that foreign-controlled firms also account for a very large share of exports. And we're talking about at least 1/3, but in many countries, half or even more. So the examples that I showed you are all examples or graphs that we've made from our tech data, our trade by enterprise characteristics data. And this is information that tries to break down trade flows, exports and imports by the types of firms that are actually engaged in these types of trade. What you see is in our database, and I have to say this list of tables is currently expanding all the time. We break down trade by size classes of firms, by economic activity or industry of firms. We make combinations to see what are the largest firms, how many partner zones. We see indeed many firms trade with only 1 or 2 other countries. By commodity groups, so we try to make tables that break down imports, for example, by product and industry, which are also within the supply and use framework, of course, very important. And most recently, we've added foreign ownership or the ownership dimension to the tech questionnaire to better understand the differences between foreign and domestically controlled firms with respect to trade. Currently in our data set, we have tech data for 33 countries, including 6 non-OECD from 2005 onwards. And we present the data at the 2-digit level of ISIC, both Rev 3 and Rev 4. And the way the data are compiled in national offices is linking trade statistics, so the trade register from customs information, with the business register. In most countries, we have a common identifier available to actually make this link at the lowest level or at the transaction level, at the lowest level of microdata that is available. Clearly, and I think all of us who are involved in linking information know that the moment you start to link 2 different data sets, or maybe even more, you start to lose information. So one of the key variables that we also collect is to show what are the matching rates. How much of total trade can we actually attribute to individual firms within an economy? And luckily for us, and as a sign of the quality of our systems, if we have a complete business register and a complete overview of our trade statistics, we do actually achieve really good matching rates of 90%, 95% in many countries. So this is very close to excellent to get a good understanding. Some issues remain. Some of those who may have seen our database will see that there is always a little part that says unknown. Actually, this is very often not unknown because it sounds a bit ignorant in many ways, but what is really behind it is that not always international trade of a country can be linked to the individual firms that are actually active in that country. We see another problem, which is the overemphasis on wholesalers. And we had the discussion already in the morning. Frédéric raised the point to say, like, well, what happens if you have one enterprise that's doing the wholesaling, you have the other enterprise in the same enterprise group that does the production, how are you going to link those two? And of course, the more detail we ask, and we do ask increasingly more detail, the more we run into confidentiality problems. So how do we want to use this information? How do we think that this type of information can be useful for us for the TIVA project, for breaking down supply and use tables, and what would be the additional data requirements that we would be needing? And this is this is of course impossible to read, but I hope you can maybe print out the presentation later on, because this is the table also presented by Nadim yesterday, the use table, in the way we would like to see it in the future, preferably a more distant future than a faraway future. But what you see is that this use table, and of course also the supply table, is broken down by firm size, by firm ownership, and by importer and exporting status. And if you look individually at the individual cells that are in this table, you can identify quite clearly what type of data is really needed. So if I would make, I'm sorry, I'm going slightly too fast. I included one very nice slide for those who are not too familiar with supply and use tables and making those calculations. This is an example of how we can account for heterogeneity in supply and use tables within the supply and use table, but also how it works in practice. And we've heard an explanation saying like, well, if we don't account for heterogeneity, we underestimate the import content of exports. And for some people, this may make perfect sense. For some people, I figured I might just explain exactly what happens in those cases. So this is a very extremely simplified example where on the left-hand side you see what happens if you treat an industry like a box in the way we do now. You record imports by industry, you record domestic purchases by industry, we record value added by industry, total output by industry, exports by industry, domestic sales by industry, and we can use that information to calculate how much of the exports is actually originating from imported components very simply by calculating the ratio. If we would split an industry, and this is the most simple split that you can think of, which is to say we have purely domestic firms. They do not trade, they do not import, they do not export, they source completely domestically, they sell completely domestically. And we have firms that are engaged in both imports and exports. And we make even a one-to-one split. And this is not very unrealistic if you think that exporters account for 90% of imports. So then what you see, and if you see all the rows add up exactly, but if you have to make the calculation of what is the ratio of imports over exports, you come up with a much higher share, because not all value added produced, which is the value added by the domestic firms, is actually ending up in using or being used in calculating the ratio of imports over exports. So this is roughly what we try to do, and how much of an impact it can have on our estimates of how important foreign content is in the export success of individual countries. So in order to produce this information, I think also the last slide actually helps to identify the different variables and the different things that we would need. We need a breakdown, and in any case between exporting and non-exporting firms. What we need is a geographical breakdown of trade by main trading partners or region, of imports and exports, distinguishing between exporting and importing firms. But we need additional information, because this first information we can still get from the tech data if we really drill down deep enough. What we also need is information that is not currently in the trade by enterprise characteristics data, which is purchases, output, value added, employment if possible, because that would be really very nice. And if you're going to do the data linking, why not take a few variables extra? Broken down by industry, of course, but also broken down by exporting and non-exporting firms. And to create this data, we would need to add the structural business statistics to the tech database. If we want to make even further breakdowns and say, okay, we also want to correct for or control for foreign ownership, or for splitting out domestic and foreign-owned firms, we need the same list as above, broken down, of course, between domestic and foreign-owned firms. And in addition, we would need exports broken down by ownership, industry, and foreign ownership. So this would require linking the tech data with the SBS, but also with FATS information. So basically, it means that we could theoretically make a breakdown of the supply and use table using existing tech information, using existing FATS information, using data collections, therefore, that are ongoing in many countries or that have been started up in many countries. From the OECD perspective, what we try to do is to say, like, okay, the best way really to do that is to engage in microdata linking exercises at the firm level, trying to link the trade flows with the individual firms, with the foreign ownership dimensions, and subsequently aggregate upwards. However, we have industry information in our supply and use tables. We have industry breakdown in our FATS data. We have industry breakdowns in our tech data. We have industry breakdowns in our structural business statistics. So very crudely, at the industry level, we could combine this information in order to make a first assessment of what is possible in accounting for heterogeneity within the supply and use table. So I will show you some slides that give some first results of this type of work. And I think these slides actually illustrate, again, the importance of accounting for heterogeneity. But as you will see in the subsequent slides that I'll be showing, we also have some problems in making the link at the macro level. So this is not a problem with the data as such, but it's a problem of making the link at the macro level within the OECD. That can hopefully much better be solved at the micro level, so at the national statistical offices. So this is one of the first examples that I'd like to show on, and we call it macro data linking for lack of any better name. And what we did is link at the industry level foreign ownership and exports and turnover. So these are three data sources. This is the foreign ownership from FAT, it's the export data from Tech, and it's the structural business statistics in terms of turnover. So you can calculate the ratio between foreign and domestically owned firms in terms of their exports, in terms of their turnover. And this illustrates what we know from academic research in many cases, that indeed foreign controlled enterprises are more export intensive than domestically controlled firms. So foreign firms are engaged more frequently in international trade compared to their total turnover. Another example, value added to turnover. So this is basically domestic value added produced as a share of turnover tends to be higher for domestically owned firms. So indeed, what we see is that foreign owned firms more frequently import or purchase domestically products rather than creating value added within their firm. So this is the ratio of value added to turnover comparing foreign firms and domestic firms. And you see we've done that across a range of different countries. I'm showing you the country summary, but this is available at the industry level as well. However, in producing this data, I mean, there's one reason why I'm showing you at the country aggregates is because the moment you start to dig down to industries, you will see the problems that we encounter when we try to make this link between the three statistics at the macro level. One of the key problems that we encounter is a problem that's common in the tech data as it is, which is the huge share of the wholesale industry in international trade. And this graph shows you from three different data sources for one country. And the country, I haven't seen them here, but we chose this country because it's one of the very few who has this data available. So this is not to illustrate how bad the Italian data are. It's actually an illustration of how good the data are, that we have all these different types of sources available at the level of breakdown necessary to make these types of calculations. And what it shows you is by industry for the year 2010, the share of imported intermediates as a share of the total intermediates used by industry. And we used three sources to compare. First, we used the supply and use table, because that is, of course, where you can get some of that information from. We also used a proportional allocation, where we attributed the data to the individual industries proportionate to their total share in products and imports. And we used the tech data, the information that we could get from tech, using the information on products and industries. And there you see the big green bar indicating the problems that we encounter in the wholesale sector, which is that too much trade gets attributed to the wholesale sector and is not redistributed to the subsequent firms who are basically using the imported products within their production. So this means that it becomes very difficult to use the tech data to make proper calculations. We've shown you some correlation coefficients to say, like, okay, well, indeed, if you compare the supply and use table and proportional allocations, this is still pretty decent. However, if you compare the supply and use table data and the tech data, you see actually a really low correlation coefficient for something that theoretically should be the same. So this is one of the key things that happens if you use this aggregated data in trying to link that with the supply and use table. You run into problems in that way. There's an additional problem. The moment you try to start to link data, for example, where you say, well, how many exporters are actually active in an industry compared to the number of firms that are active in an industry? We've encountered cases where there's more exporters than firms. Even though, and I have to say, for some countries this has to do with the exact unit of observation or the statistical unit that's included within the source, but in many European countries this is supposed to be the same. So it theoretically, again, it should not be possible that there are more exporters in an industry compared to the number of firms that are actually there. If you, again, look at the variables, so that is moving beyond the statistical unit, but really assuming that the aggregation upward of the data in the different data sources is happening with a lot of consistency and attention to quality, what we see here is that the number of industries for which total exports that we derive from the tech data are larger than turnover that we derive from the structural business statistics is actually really, really quite large. You see, for some countries, we see, and this is two-digit ISEC, so we expect a total of around 60, 70 industries to be available. But you see that substantial numbers of industries, and again, breaking also down, making a breakdown by firm size, a substantial number of industries show problems in this area. More inconsistencies. Tech and FATS data. One of the new innovations in tech has been to ask about foreign ownership of the exporting and importing firms. In the FATS data, there is a question that asks for foreign and domestically owned firms, do you actually import or export, and if so, how much? Again, theoretically, this is exactly the same information. We want to know for the firms that are active in our country, are you engaged in trade, are you engaged, or are you foreign owned, yes or no? And what you see here is, for example, the differences in the share of foreign-owned firms in imports, comparing the tech data and the FATS information. And again, unfortunately, I'm showing the results for Italy because this is one of the few countries that actually supplies this type of data, both in our tech questionnaire and in our FATS questionnaire. And you see that there are big differences in many cases where we see that, in particular, the tech data seems to be missing the trade from some of the domestic firms, because we see a consistent overestimation of the share of foreign-owned firms in trade if we compare the tech to the FATS data. Or perhaps it's in reverse, that the FATS data are underestimating. And yeah, we really have no option of knowing that, actually, from our perspective. Industry 21, just in case you were wondering, what's this really big industries of pharmaceutical products. So clearly, these are very interesting types of work, but also highlight that we have a lot of challenges ahead of us in harmonizing the statistics or the raw data that we have available within our statistical offices in order to come up with what we call this integrated or harmonized accounting system or framework, where all these numbers should add up and should be the same in many cases, so that they can be actually used to produce this information. So what is not possible for us at the international level is something that is possible at the national level. So at the national level, when you make the links at the micro level by linking trade data with your business registers, with subsequently your structural business statistics, it is possible to make these harmonized tables in the same way as you produce FATS data consistent with your total SBS statistics. You can add the tech dimension or the trade dimension to this information as well, in order to make sure that this adds up and that this therefore can be used. Because if we can be sure that the information that we receive or from the tech data, from the FATS data, from the structural business statistics is actually harmonized and can be combined and compared, we can use that information to start breaking down the supply and use table, because in that way we will have all the information necessary for the main components of the supply and use table. I'm not talking about the trade margins and all the really difficult issues, but to really look about the production or the input-output matrix. We can make this breakdown by enterprise characteristics. So this is something that we are really we'll continue to work on for the next few years. As you've seen, we currently have 33 countries in our tech database, 61 and counting in TIVA. So one of the key challenges that we have is to increase the country coverage. And we really see also that the combination of tech and TIVA is creating a lot of interest among particularly also the people who are here to try to make those links available. We want to do more work in terms of the methodology, methodological improvements for tech, better explanation or better understanding of the matching rates where you have non-resident trades, firms that are not resident in your economy, not part of your business register, but that are trading in a way that it is attributed to that particular country. A better assignment of trade to retailers and wholesalers, basically trying to look through that particular category of firms to the underlying economic activities for which these types of goods are actually imported. And of course, one of the things that we are continuously working on is to explore to what extent we can deal with confidentiality problems, because we do see and recognize that the more detail we ask, the current tech data breaking down by foreign ownership, etc., we run into issues of confidentiality quite quickly. And we think that some of these problems can be overcome by deciding on a harmonized way of treating confidentiality, or trying to say, okay, well, these are in any case the minimum groups for which we should be gathering information, and that is so important and so substantial for our economy that we will not run into these problems related to confidentiality. I talked mostly about goods, trading goods. Trade by enterprise characteristics is something that relates to merchandise trade. My colleague will discuss the services part, because that is the second major challenge, because clearly trade is not only goods, it's also services. And this is also something that we need to attribute in any case within TIVA to industry. So that is already services trade by industry or by enterprise characteristics. But clearly, if we are breaking down the supply and use table, we also need to break down the services trade by these enterprise characteristics. So this is also one of the topics that we'll have to do more work on. One of the things is, well, we also try to take a little bit our own responsibility here. Is tech for a long time has been a data collection that we've been engaging in, that we try to do, but we have not been doing a lot of marketing or a lot of publication of what are really the policy implications or the conclusions that you can derive from that. And we really see it also as our responsibility to show what are the conclusions that you can derive from that. So we built a website, of course, for the dissemination. We are drafting country notes at the moment. So for each of the individual countries that is included within our database, we make a small note of 2 to 3 pages explaining what can you see, how do you compare with other OECD countries. And of course, we will continue on the line of research that I just explained about linking at the macro level, doing the feasibility studies of what can you really learn from the different types of data and from combining that information. We try to even expand that by working with some individual countries who have the microdata available and who are interested in trying to build these types of data that have already been published by some of you. I think it's also important to highlight that we don't do this as a sort of a small research activity on a Friday afternoon, but that this is something also that we've been quite explicitly asked to do by our working party on trading goods and services statistics at the OECD, who's part of the committee on statistics and statistical policies. And of course, within that committee, we have recently established an expert group on extended supply and use tables, and we will have our first meeting tomorrow afternoon to be discussing many of these things to try and see how can we overcome some of the problems that we are encountering and that have been illustrated at the macro level, but the further down you dig, the more problems we will no doubt encounter. So we will have some very interesting conversations there. I think I will leave it at that. Hubert, I'm not sure, should I talk more?
Let's... Oh. Let's
not.
give you some rest. And
Oh, was I
perhaps
talking too
open the
fast?
floor. Unless, Fabienne, unless you have something very, concluding note, or perhaps we open for some question and you may use your answer to make your point. So please, can you? Yeah, I fully concur. It's but now the difficult part. You have to answer.
Okay. No, I guess it's quite interesting what you're doing. Bringing into the picture heterogeneity is great. But let me ask you, are you doing it, for example, in trade? You are having all the enterprises and all the different firms that are involved, because what you show us is only the big picture, no? You really didn't show the heterogeneity about the specific sectors, no? Have you done that for each sector? I'm in the page, in the web page that you have, and where it shows you. You can find the data that you have here in the page that you have.
Perhaps we could have another question, and so you can prepare
can,
your answer.
yeah.
I recognize the United Nations Statistical Division, Ivo.
How formal. Thank you, Fabian. Very, very, very nice presentation. I agree with all of them that applauded, and I applauded with them. The point that I basically want to raise is that when in my mind, there's a way to look at, firm heterogeneity within the SNA framework, right? Or that new framework that we are aspiring to have, right? And I think we have to make that distinction. So if we want to talk about the way we look at firm heterogeneity, and you do it in the way you do it, in export, size, and foreign, then I see there is a lot of correlation, very high correlation between these characteristics. So I would say if you take one, you might probably get very far. Why would you do the further splits, right? So basically your top, if you export, you probably are foreign owned, you have a larger size because you basically cover about 50–60% of it. Now, why do you want to go all the way then? That's basically my point that I'm going to make. So that's one. But that is also about how we can talk about these breakdowns, because in itself it requires a lot of work for the countries to actually bring in these additional characteristics, which basically, in terms of the overall analysis and outcomes, probably may not be that significant. In this morning discussion, we had also the global value chain discussions, right? Where you really say, look, let's now look at an enterprise characteristics in its value chain and talk about its business functions. I don't hear any of that in your discussion. And I think it is important that we start discussing that element. Because I think it's there where we can really bring that analytical insight in terms of firm heterogeneity that we have to look at. Now, if you have that discussion, I think you will get around that discussion also, or you come round to the discussion about what is now the unit that we want characteristics about. And a lot of these inconsistencies that you come up, in my opinion, is the unit from which we collect, right? You call them firms, you call them enterprises. I don't know the distinction between a firm and an enterprise. Hubert calls them firm and enterprise, and he says a firm is an establishment. So I really increasingly get confused of what is now the characteristics, what we're after, and we should be very clear of what we're after. And in my opinion, we're looking in a global value chain more at another unit than I think these kind of characteristics are actually collected for, and the way we want to organize these business registers.
Okay, Fabienne, if you can answer. After that, I recognize two other questions. And we'll have some time, guys, we'll have some time also for a general discussion, but because we have two other presentations after that. So, Fabienne, please.
Thank you. To answer the first question, what we've done at the macro level is using the tech data. The tech data is available on our website, so if you look at the data link, you will get all the information on trade by enterprise characteristics, so breaking down the trade value by all the different characteristics that I mentioned. I can give you a link to our FATS statistics as well, so they are also available online. This work is still more kind of a research or experimental work, so we are finalizing the paper, so that should be very shortly available, and I'm sure we can distribute it among the participants who are interested. I think it's important to emphasize that this is a feasibility study. So what we try to do is to show how important it is, how we can use existing information, and I think that that's also important to realize that this is existing gatherings within countries, and they do use, like you ask, a full list of all the enterprises in the business register and the full information on international trade transactions. So this is almost 100% coverage of both on the enterprise and on the trade side. So in that way, it's quite one of the easiest links to make in many cases, because you're not working with different samples. So that is what is available and what is the status for this type of work. Then coming, of course, to Ivo's question, why go all the way? I think one of the key things is that we need to recognize is that a lot of the characteristics go hand in hand, as you very well say, and as I've also shown in my presentation. However, the consequences are not always the same, and the policy debates are also very different. So if you're talking about exporting and non-exporting firms, your questions as a policymaker are very different. So and we will get questions from policymakers saying, okay, well, how can I get firms to do more exports? Or how do they benefit my economy compared to those that do not export? Why would you want to make a distinction between foreign and domestically owned firms? Well, this is one of the things where we talked about also yesterday, is because the value added and the stickiness of value added is very different across these firms. So you have to make the distinction between foreign owned and domestically owned. And it can be that foreign owned firms do a lot of trade, but in many countries, it's not the case that the domestic firms can be assumed as non-traders, because that's just not the case. Let's face it. So these are things that are important to recognize. Coming to your point to say, like, well, but it increases a lot of the burden. We need to compile all this information. I think this was exactly the point of the presentation, to say, well, actually, we have a lot of these data sources available. A lot of countries are making the tech data available. We have the FATS statistics that is established data collection that increasingly more countries are engaging in. And it's not additional data collection, it's micro data linking of some of the key variables that we are interested in. And of course we can think about, the moment we have decided on business functions and the first surveys on business functions are actually there, then it would be great to see if we can include those. But I don't think that should prevent us now from recognizing that, yes, of course, trading status and foreign ownership are among the key distinguishing variables. If you talk about value chains, they're among the key distinguishing variables. If you talk about impact of globalization on economies, so if we remember the trade and economic globalization of the theme of the conference, these are really the topics that we're talking about. So to just say, well, let's combine it into sort of something global, something nothing, I think I would challenge a lot of countries to go much further because of the policy relevance.
Okay, thank you. We have two other questions at least. Keep it simple, no statement.
I'll try and be as brief as I can. Thank you, Fabienne. That was a really interesting presentation. I think you've clarified a lot of issues that have come up earlier. Just one thing that struck me, you showed up some Irish data and it got my attention in relation to trade and production. And my understanding is this is drawn from the trade data and then the production data from the survey data, the SBS or whatever. I would just sort of, I suppose, draw your attention to the fact that this is unadjusted for the impact of globalization, which is what we're here to talk about too. And we would have quite a substantial amount of adjustments to our data. The trade data is simply cross-border flows, not reflecting changes in ownership and so on, and that can affect the data. I wonder why you wouldn't go back to the national accounts totals maybe and recalibrate in that way. That would seem to me to be a good starting point, because it tells you really the scale of the adjustments that have been made at the country level. Thank you.
There's another question, perhaps.
Mine is just a small comment. I think that firms organize themselves in the way they think it is more efficient. Sometimes you go to the field and find a firm that has a legal structure to manage the payroll, another legal structure to manage import and other to manage export and the production. So at the beginning you think you have 6 companies and at the end it's just one, but they divide their operation in that way for specific purposes because it's more efficient for them.
Thank you. There is a last one. I can't avoid it because it's Ronald. and after that, you answer and we move to the next presentation. Yeah. I mean,
no coffee break.
If
yes, I am here. I actually saw Sally much earlier with a question still. But anyway, mine is less than a minute. And yes, I know. And it was a little bit in relation also to what Henri from Costa Rica said. It's about statistical capacity building. So I just make a plea as a comment that in this area we should build up capacity building because it involves business registers, especially developing country I'm talking now, having a good business register, having a good trade statistics, trying to link them, and there are all kinds of practical issues surrounded with it. There are also some institutional issues around it. And so it's just a plea that we have to work together at the international level to organize the statistical capacity building on this.
Okay, the jury told me that, okay, you can. So, please, can you give por favor, el micrófono al compatriota?
Thank you. It's only one remark as an answer to your question, because sure, there is the problem of the statistical unit, enterprise group versus legal unit. But I think there is also the question of the concept. For example, for wholesale trade, it's exactly what you told before, what you say this morning. For national account, a suit is not a question of treatment, it's another concept. You put the margin. It's like attribute a part of value-added chain. So you are the difference. So it's not only a question of the unit, but the concepts are different. Sometimes it's a sector, sometimes it's branch. So we cannot solve some differences.
Okay. Lamento mucho, pero sorry. The time for questions is closed. Fabienne, could you answer?
Yes.
I'm sure the next presentation will dig a bit more into this thing. So you'll have the opportunity to ask Luis or G or even go back. And please, Fabienne.
I think sort of the first and last questions are slightly related in sort of talking about different concepts and different definitions within, on the one hand, the trade microdata, and then, of course, how do we deal with trade in national accounts? And I think what is important is, particularly for Ireland, for example, these are data that, these are not microdata that we have compiled. No, this is what the Irish Statistical Office sends us if we ask them for their trade by enterprise characteristics data. And clearly those merchandise trade statistics will be from a different definition from what in the end ends up in your balance of payments and national accounts. So of course there's a difference there, and I think what I try to do is also to illustrate that that on the one hand we can use this information from tech, from FATS, from the existing classifications that we have. We know which firms are engaged in trade, we know which firms are foreign owned, but the best way would be, of course, to go to the national offices and try to really establish tech data from the bottom up all the way to national accounts, so that we have exactly this breakdown of the supply and use table according to all the different dimensions that we would like. So this is, we are very clear on that this is the target, and that, of course, the fact that the concepts are different in cases means that it becomes very, very difficult to try to do these types of activities. And I think my presentation showed exactly why the difficulties are there and how big they sometimes can be. So this was, I think, yeah, this is roughly what I can say about this, and as well with respect to the concepts. Then with Ronald, statistical capacity building. Yes, of course, this is very important, and this is something that within the OECD we work a lot with our members, with our key partners, with others who approach us to say, like, well, you know, we would be interested in building this type of information. What do you know in terms of methodological handbooks? What do you have in terms of additional information of what would be a good way to do these types of information? So I think it would definitely be something that yeah, more international organizations can be involved in. Yeah.
Okay, I guess once again. So now we will discuss the same thing, but with a focus on services with Luis. In fact, I was surprised because I know Fabienne as a service specialist,
No,
and
I'm
we were
not.
discussing. Yeah, I know.
Well,
I had a wrong conception. You know, those things happen.
well, this tends to happen. Yeah.
So please, Luis.
Thank you. So I will describe you a little bit more about other project that we have in the European Union, which we hope it will be somehow exported to other countries and to other international organizations, which actually is another side of the same coin, which is looking into the services trade by enterprise characteristics. So I will certainly explain you what it is, what is Stec, as we call it, generally speaking. I will describe you a little bit on the evolution of the milestones that this project has had so far, the way we decided to organize the work. We also set up a task force, as I will explain immediately. So the activities that were achieved by the participants in the task force and the participants in the project. And I will explain a little bit about the data linking and the kind of analytical results and conclusions that we have reached so far, because it's an ongoing project. And this will reach me to the last point of the presentation, which is the future steps of this project. So Stec stands for Services Trade by Enterprise Characteristics. It's an EU project which basically tries to do the same as we have seen for tech, which is linking trade in services with business statistics. So our main objectives are also basically the same. So we want to link this trade data with these particular or specific characteristics of the enterprises that we have developed for a number of years for the tech, and we want, as I said, to do the same in terms of looking into economic characteristics of the enterprises who are trading services, number of employees, turnover, and these kind of things. And also, as let's say an important objective is to look into the role of small and medium enterprises on one side in trading services, and on the other side certainly the role of multinational enterprises. A final important point, once more, I think it has been repeated several times, it is the fact that no new data collection is foreseen. So the idea is to make a micro data linking exercise exploiting what is already available in both sides, in trading services statistics and on the side of business statistics. So what are somehow the history of this project? Now, we have to say that we were inspired by this conference that took place in Geneva at the WTO premises in 2011 on this global forum on trade and globalization. So the idea came to our mind about the possibility to develop some kind of this microdata analysis for trading services. So we took some time for reflecting and thinking about how it could be organized, and finally we went in May 2012 to our main statistical authority in the European Union, which is the European System Statistical Committee, who actually endorsed this project. And that was the, let's say, the triggering of the project in Eurostat. So obviously we decided not to do it by ourselves. We needed certainly the cooperation of at least one of our member states, and we decided to look for participants and also for national experts that wanted to not only to cooperate in the designing of a methodology for doing so, but also in making a pilot exercise, a data collection or a data linking pilot exercise. So the task force actually was set up and it started to work in January 2013. We have different meetings and where we discussed methodological issues, data collection issues, and the first results for some of the participants, not for all of them, have been delivered this year in the spring. And actually we managed to present some results of this pilot project in a working group on trading services statistics in the last month of June. Results have not been yet disseminated because we are also waiting for some extra data from some participants that have not yet delivered the data. But I will be able to show you some aggregated results later on. Well, here you have some details about the task force. So we had 9 countries participating in the project. We had, as I said before, 3 meetings. And actually, what we have received so far is data from 6 participating countries. Well, in terms of coverage, you may think that this is not a big coverage. I mean, these 6 countries are representing about 14% of the export of services and 12% of the import of services in the EU. But, okay, as a starting point, we believe this is something that we can use to raise some conclusions, particularly on let's say, the procedural point of view for further development. What we asked the participants to do was to make this data linking exercise. On one side, the data from trading services statistics, and then make a link to 2 fundamental additional data sources. One, business registers, and second, some economic data on the structural business statistics. So in that sense, we went a little bit beyond what has been done so far on tech, where in this case the share of these professional and technical services is bigger. So we can go into certainly details. Obviously I didn't say it, but what are we showing here is a kind of average calculation for the 6 countries for which we have data. So it's not reflecting any particular country situation, but an average of the 6 countries for which we have this information. So some conclusions of the exercise of linking these 3 data sources. Well, first of all, microdata linking, and this has been clearly transmitted by the participating countries, is a burdensome exercise. It takes some time, it's even manual work, and requires some know-how about how to do it. It's a time-consuming process as well. This non-linkable part cannot be avoided. I mentioned before that we have the issue of financial services. We have some services sector that are not based actually on enterprise surveys. We have administrative sources. We have in some cases the problem of SPEs. We have also the issue of the statistical unit which is used for collecting the data and which is present in the business register. So there are a number of issues which are preventing to make this link. Regarding confidentiality, well, we have realized that at aggregated level it does not represent a major issue. Obviously when you go into more and more and more details it may become a problem. And also what is important, as I just described, is that it allows to present information in different ways, and this is something that is well appreciated and which will give us a potential for more analytical analysis. So what is next? Because I mean, basically this is a project that at this point in time we can consider as temporarily finalized, waiting for some additional results from some participating countries. And as I said, we are planning to disseminate the results when we have a complete picture next year. But we have already thought about the continuation of this project because obviously we find quite usefulness on it. And we have decided to convene again a task force that will go on with the project. But now we want to have more concrete aims. Now we have gained some experience in this project and we want to be now defining more concrete objectives. In this regard, learning from the experience of the first project, we will discuss improvements in the methodology compared to what we have achieved in the first pilot exercise. We will look into issues related to secondary confidentiality that were raised during the data collection process. So the idea is that we want to disseminate more information and disclose more cells. And a key point for us as well is to try to define a framework for a potential regular data collection of Stec. So this should be our medium-term objective. Certainly the idea is also that we want to involve more countries in this new round, and also hopefully have more data that will allow to go on with the project. And as I said, as medium-term objective, try to include this as a regular data collection exercise in the European Union. So I think that's all I wanted to explain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm impressed. I mean, statistician community is supposed to be very conservative. What you have been able to achieve in such a short period and on such a difficult subject as trade in services is really impressive, at least for me. That you got the idea while at WTO, and even more surprised. we are not known for being a think tank. So questions, please? Okay. Was that?
Pete Landefeld. Yeah.
Please.
This occurs to me also in the goods side as well as the services side, but some of the large asymmetries we have in bilateral totals, I'm not sure what's being done here. It wasn't discussed, but it seems like it could have sort of a general rule, which would be something like, when I got in the business, you used to assume that merchandise imports were better than exports because they were subject to custom control, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know the U.S. and Canada actually exchanged them and, used the U.S. imports are used for Canadian exports, vice versa. Well, in services, I think the flip is the case, because you can identify pretty well at least the bigger service exporters, so you do a better job of collecting export statistics and services than imports. And you could do that same sort of switch. And at least everybody doing these various exercises would have at least a common first set of assumptions about how to reconcile them that might promote a lot more comparability across the various statistics produced, and you have at least some basis for that. And also, if you want to back it out at some point, it's easy enough to do because it's such a simplistic assumption. But you do worry in looking at all these results, given these large asymmetries, what you really got there. And now it may make your linking task even more difficult at the micro level. But it seems like it ought to be addressed, and maybe it is in your statistics, but just a thought.
Thank you very much, Steve. Questions? You need questions because I lost my next panelist. Thank you very much. El micrófono, por favor.
Thanks. It's not so much a question as a comment. I think both presentations were excellent in giving us an idea of where we need to go to provide some of this new data that's we're gonna need to look at some of these different questions. So I would commend you on that. And I didn't say it in the last presentation, but I really do think the idea of building these micro level databases, but then linking it back up to our macro estimates and preserving that integrity. It's kind of like what we're doing on the household side, where we're taking macro household numbers using distributional household surveys to get at the detail. I kind of see this as the same way. These files give us the distributional information we need. We apply them to the macro estimates we have, and we preserve that consistency. So I think this is a very good initiatives. And I think we'll be able to really learn from each other as we link these files together and as we work with them. Some of the best techniques, as Steve mentioned, what we should, prior or consider better data than others, I think is a good way forward. So I just thank you very much for that. They gave us a lot of ideas. I know me a lot of ideas going back to Canada in terms of what we can do.